The First Berserker Khazan began its life as Project BBQ, an action combat MMO that was to be the successor for Dungeon Fighter Online. But after several years of development, it was rebranded as a soulslike. And for me personally, someone who has a lot less time than I used to for grindy MMOs, and also a lot less tolerance for their pay-to-win mechanics, I personally am quite glad. Though I can certainly understand if this is a bitter pill for those who are looking forward to the MMO. With that said, what is the First Berserker Khazan about? Well, if I could sum it up in one sentence, I would say that it's a Souls-like that cares as much about the spectacle as it does the challenge. Or maybe that this is the Studio Trigger anime of Souls-likes? Combat is fast-paced. It's gory, it's over the top, and it feels extremely anime in a way that is viscerally satisfying. Though the game doesn't exactly start out that way. In fact, in the early game, combat is notably slower paced, with resource management almost feeling oppressive. You're going to run out of stamina a lot, and it's going to get frustrating. But as you get into the mid-game, obtain a few skills, invest some points into your stamina, it opens up a lot, and before you know it, you're flying through enemies using a million combos, practically button mashing, and it feels incredible. But remember, this is a Souls-like, and there are definitely times where the game, or more accurately, the game's bosses, will beat you down. For me personally, there are two bosses that took me hours of attempts, but once I got it, I got it. I was able to sit in that flow space, where I felt like I was the first Berserker himself, contemptuously turning aside enemy strikes before unleashing a devastating counter or chaining together dozens of skills to continually break the enemy's stance to a point where they didn't even really get to fight back before I fully depleted their stagger bar and unleashed a finishing combo. So, from a combat and boss design perspective, I can safely say this is one of the best Souls-likes I've played that wasn't made by From Software. Unfortunately, I can't say the same about the level design and the story. In terms of level design, there's certainly a lot of enemies hiding around doors, traps in the floors, long twisting corridors, all the things you'd expect. But there wasn't anything cool to explore or find in those areas. In part because I had a hard time paying attention to or caring about the story, so if I found a lore item, well, so what? Which for me led to a feeling of, okay, I don't care what's around the next corner, I just want to get to the next save point so I can get to the boss faster, making this part of the game kind of bland, boring, and even a little bit tedious. But like I said before, the boss fights more than make up for it when you do get to them.
Your fate destroyed by one you trusted. A fallen star, torn from its orbit.
Who do you think would be more famous? Great General Khazan, hero of the Empire, or the man who killed him?
And so let's start with one of the game's standout features, the combat. Because when designing the combat for First Berserker Khazan, I think Neapel took the rule of cool to its maximum. You get plenty of abilities that have gigantic flashy animations, where giant red arcs are painted across the screen, and no, that isn't just the enemy's blood, that's the nether energy or phantom energy that you get to activate. Also, when you exhaust enemies, you don't just do a simple little backstab, no, this is a brutal execution. In some cases, it's even a literal insta-kill. And against bosses, oh boy does it take big chunks out of their health. But the game also takes some cues from Sekiro, with a big focus on the perfect block mechanic. When you get good at a fight, you feel like a parry god. Because yes, parrying in this game actually feels good. Most of the time. More on that later. Plus, the game encourages you to mix things up by throwing in things like burst attacks that need to be countered, grabs that need to be dodged, and the fact that you are burning away your stamina bar by continuing attacking, but you have spirit skills that don't cost any stamina, and in some cases may even restore some. And yes, I know, I mentioned grab attacks. If you're thinking back to Shadow of the Erdtree and getting some PTSD, don't worry, these are much easier to avoid. When it comes to combat, you have 3 weapons to choose from: dual wield, greatsword, and spear. Personally, I found that spear, especially with the moonlight stance, meshed the best with my personal playstyle, so that's what I spent most of my playtime on. I did, however, mess with both the greatsword and the dual wield, and if you want to see my thoughts on each, check the video up in the card and down below. But in the second zone or so, you get a resource called Spirit. This builds up as you hit enemies, deal damage, that kind of thing. and it's used at first just to summon some Vermilion Lances, giving Khazan a ranged attack. But as you progress, you can also get a bunch of skill points and unlock whole skill trees with several different active skills, all of which cost spirit. These add a lot of mobility. Throughout the footage, you're going to see me using 3 of them. Phantom Heatwave, basically a perfect block with a short duration. Trance, that deals damage, is very good at breaking enemy stances and often puts you behind your foe. And Spiral Thrust, the giant charge-up move with a burst of crimson energy that impales foes. I especially like using this right after I've broken an enemy and used the brutal attack. Now, as is the norm for Souls-like, boss fights are all about patience. The boss is going to send a flurry of attacks, and anything that doesn't get blocked is really going to hurt. But against normal enemies, I found I could just let loose and spam a mix of my skills, especially heavy attacks, to annihilate them in seconds while perpetually breaking their stance. This doesn't quite work everywhere, especially in the late game. There are some enemies that are enraged and can't be stance broken. But for anything that can, it works really well, and when it does, it's extremely fun because you feel that power fantasy of being stronger than the enemies around you. But with that said, where the game's combat truly shines is in the boss battles. So, the best way for me to demonstrate that is to show the combat in action by talking about a boss. This is Scalpel, a boss that appears about 2/3 of the way through the game, and he is a nasty one. I spent around 5 hours dying over and over and over before I finally got him down. Also, this is going to be maybe something that people would consider a little bit of a spoiler, but you know what? If a dev is going to take a cheap shot, I'm going to arm you against it. After you reduce his health bar to 0, he has a phase 2, and you will even get a mission complete screen sometimes that makes you think you've actually won. This is a bait, there is a phase 2, the devs are just messing with you. But here's the thing, as frustrating as I found that to be, over the hours of attempts, I was able to learn Scalpel's attack pattern. I was not only perfect blocking a lot of his strikes, but I could even use the reflection counterattack to get in some extra damage. I guess I could call it a reflection parry, because it has the same kind of really tricky parry timing as most Souls-likes, where yes, it does a lot of damage, it is very effective, but you can't use it on every attack, and it is extremely punishing to use. Also, I ended up measuring most of my boss fights in stagger phases. How long until a boss's stamina bar is depleted? There's 2 types. The purple type, which does not regenerate over time. Most inhuman enemies have a purple stagger bar. This is good because it makes the fight quite a bit easier. But then many of the humanoid enemies have a white stamina bar that works exactly like yours. So what you need to do is block their attack sequences and then hit them really hard at the end to annihilate the remaining portion of their stagger. Unfortunately, because they are human enemies, they often have abilities that help them recharge stamina, so if you're not quick, you might find the boss just doesn't get staggered very frequently. And honestly, I really like this. It's a simple thing, but it makes a lot of the fights feel very different. Because again, I measured these boss fights in how long until the boss's stamina bar is depleted, and I get to do as much damage as possible in that short window before ending the sequence with a special brutal attack. Or maybe using Phantom Judgment, a special set ability, to give myself even longer to do as much damage as possible. I found this to be very rewarding, and also I found myself using heavy attacks and a lot of these slower, harder hitting abilities that are very good at depleting stagger bars more than I do in other Souls-likes as a result. I was also really impressed with how different each of the game's 16 bosses feel. Maluka, for example, is basically a badass chaos samurai, constantly sheathing his sword to unleash lethal iejutsu that you need to avoid. Volbeno, on the other hand, has rhythmic attacks that aren't unlike a blacksmith hammering away to shape a tool or a blade, or maybe to try to hammer Khazan into the ground. Yeah, you're going to need to parry a good bit here. And then there are mage battles. Each of these takes Spectacle to the next level, as you need to dodge volleys of projectiles. But luckily, they also reward aggression, as I found it much easier to break the stance of caster enemies than that of melee fighters. Now, personally, my favorite fight overall was Reese. I found her to be a pretty easy boss, especially as she's one of the later ones in the game, but the atmosphere and the music are absolutely perfect. So here's just a short clip of me fighting her for about a minute. And last but not least, boss combat feels really, really good because you get Lacrima, think souls from Souls-likes, or runes from Elden Ring, for each attempt. So, instead of spending a lot of time grinding away at normal enemies before you go to attempt a tough boss, you might as well just throw yourself at that tough boss because you will continually get that Lacrima and be able to keep leveling up as you go through fighting the challenging encounter. I like this. It feels to me like a much more natural gameplay loop to get stronger by fighting the strongest foes as opposed to getting stronger by crushing hordes of weaker ones and spending quite a bit of time doing it. And also, since Lacrima appears outside the boss room after death, there's no worries about losing it here either, which is in fact better than when you're fighting all the small enemies throughout the levels where sometimes you can get ganked and lose your Lacrima. Okay, I said last up there, but I do have one small complaint, and it's a familiar one for anyone who's played a lot of Souls-likes. Some attacks are animation traps, where there's an overly long delay, an example of this here, where the entire thing happens way slower than you'd expect because the boss just kind of sits there and winds up and, takes a nap and then finally hits you. This sort of artificial difficulty is not fun, and it does crop up from time to time. It would have been great if the game gave Khazan some sort of execution move, horribly long charge, completely impractical in normal combat, but able to specifically counter this kind of boss move. And you know what? That kind of execution for a slow, overly telegraphed attack would be exactly the sort of thing that would fit in the brutal world of the First Berserker Khazan. Now, as you could probably already tell, I wasn't super thrilled with the level design. It's okay, but it's not great. And I think part of this is because the boss fights reward you with Lacrima, so instead of trash feeling meaningful where I'm trying to get interesting loot or to get stronger, I was always just eager to get to the next boss fight. I was running through trash and perfectly happy to skip as much as possible because I felt like it was something in my way that didn't really give me anything of value. There are also times, like this area near the end of a game, where I can't help but wonder if a level was designed with a jump button in mind. And later, that jump button got removed as part of the iterative process, because I've played platforming levels in games before, but I don't think I've ever tried to platform in a game that didn't have a jump, and so it was mostly falling and, well, always going down. It felt really, really janky. There were also a few times where it looked like there's easy access to something, but it would be this tiny little ledge just a couple inches high, and Khazan couldn't get over it, so you'd have to go all the way around. Again, these things don't ruin the entire game, but when combined with the fact that the levels and the trash didn't feel great to begin with, in part because I didn't care about the story, and in part because the boss fights were so interesting and rewarding, I'd say this is absolutely something the game could have done without. Just make it a boss rush, skip the rest. Alright, so next up, I want to talk about stats, gear, skills, and, well, overall build craft. First, you have the stats: vitality, endurance, strength, willpower, and proficiency. So for example, vitality primarily increases health, but it does also allow you to wear heavier armor, increase your resistances, and add a bit of attack damage. In fact, that's one trend. All of the stats increase your attack damage by at least 1 point. So, you always feel like you're getting more damage, even if you're investing into your defenses. Which is why I've invested so heavily into both vitality and endurance, especially endurance feels really, really good with the extra stamina. Where the buildcraft gets a little bit more interesting is skill trees. So each weapon has its own skill tree. Here's the dual wield tree, which I don't have any points in because I'm playing spear. Here's the greatsword tree, which, yep, you guessed it, no points because I'm playing spear. Here is the spear tree. So the first thing that I went for was swift attack. I used my swift attacks a lot, and the moonlight stance feels really good. Not only do you get the cool ghosty after images, but you end up doing a lot of damage, especially with the heavy attack that's more of a moonlight sweep, called Full Moon. And from there, I kind of started filling out some of the defensive stuff over in the guard tree, which is where I discovered Phantom Heatwave, the active ability that allows Khazan to block all attacks for a short duration. Originally, this was 1 spirit, not 2, which was totally insane. It could basically refund its cost, and you'd just permanently Phantom Heatwave and kill everything. Yeah, maybe there's a reason that got nerfed. But then, I started adding in Trance, a skill that I find to be very, very fun. Though as a note, it really sort of unlocks after you have Trance Liberation. And then I got Spiral Thrust, because, I mean, look at it. It's a super big red attack that does tons of damage. You can also weave in things like 0 Point, combos that modify your normal attacks when executed at the right time. In the common tree, you have a bunch of bonuses that apply to pretty much everything Khazan does, such as buffing up Phantom Form, increasing counterattack, buffing the Javelin, which I don't use too much, buffing up the brutal attacks, that's how you get the execute stuff. and also buffing the reflection, aka the parry. This offers a lot of customization, though I haven't really found any practical way to flex between, say, using both a spear and a greatsword, especially since you can't really just swap them in combat. Then you have a gear, which is a little bit less interesting. Because sure, I have all these sort of weapons, and they seem interesting, they have names, they have stats. The thing is, most of the modifiers are random, and rarity determines the number of stats. So, blue spear, 1 random attribute. Purple spear, 2. Pink spear, 3. Legendary spear, 3 random attributes, and a fixed attribute, which in this case is a damage increase when defeating enemies. Really good when clearing trash, maybe not so good against bosses. I found that the gear stuff was honestly the least interesting part of the build craft, as for the most part, you just look for stuff where the set bonus is interesting. For example, I'm currently wearing the Fallen Lord set. This buffs the full moon damage, so heavy attacks hit really hard, and spiral thrust damage. But at other times, I have also used the Crush Dream set. This allows you to deal lightning damage. I've used the Soul Eater set, where you get Phantom Judgment, basically resetting the stun period on a boss for even more damage. And I've also used, where is it here? Somewhere here. The Golden set, for the Moonlight Awakening, the trance damage, and the rear assault damage. Exactly which sets you use will gonna depend on what weapon you're using, as some of the sets are universal, Soul Eater for example, and some of them are weapon specific, like Fugitive Mage, which is a greatsword set. So if you want the full 8-piece bonus, you're definitely going to want to use a greatsword. There are also the phantom bonuses, which is honestly one aspect that's a little bit disappointing to me, because you get this really cool phantom abilities page. You can have 1 phantom ally. These represent the different personalities of the Blade Phantom. Only one's active at a given time. You get a passive bonus, in this case, guard stamina damage decrease, and then special bonuses as you collect materials to awaken it. So it restores 150 stamina upon performing a Brink Guard, for example. That's a perfect block. The thing about that is, Keshta the Unyielding for the stamina recovery is super OP, and the only other one that I found to be useful is Maximilian the Impenetrable, and even then, I probably should have just stuck to Keshta. So the balance here felt a little off, but hopefully it'll be addressed in a future patch. The game's story revolves around revenge. Khazan was betrayed, and the Blade Phantom is bound to Charon's will, so they have to forge an unlikely alliance. That way, Khazan can get his revenge, and the Blade Phantom can go kill Chaos. The way this comes about is pretty metal. The Blade Phantom possesses Khazan, and Khazan, after beating the Blade Phantom, offers for them to work together. This was right at the start of the game, and I found it pretty cool. I was actually hoping the story would explore their relationship more. Maybe you'd even get to meet or use special abilities of the different phantoms. I guess that's sort of implied with all the different weapon skills, but it wasn't explored in a story sense. Sadly, the story focused more on the events in the past leading up to where we are now and the slow corruption of the Empire. The characters were fine, I guess, but ultimately I found them forgettable to the point where I started just skipping the cutscenes. In short, I don't know what's going on, but I think this pretty much just sums up the story.
I'm here to kill Chaos. Looks like Chaos has been waiting for us. I only know one thing. I want to kill Chaos. We're here to kill Chaos.
No. I become Chaos.
Now, something else a bit weird are the vestigial MMO systems. Stuff that, depending on who you are, could be considered a fun little extra, or, if you're like me, a huge pain in the ass. But it does feel like some of these things are a little bit too MMO-ish. Like with gear. The fact that you have all of these different rarities and all of these different levels, and pretty much everything that drops from most enemies is random, feels very MMO-like, where players were expected to grind and replace their gear every few levels. In a game like this, where there's supposed to be some sort of meaning in I defeated this foe and now I can wear their armor, that sense of meaning is totally destroyed by the fact that some of this armor, which is tied to the bosses and the lore, just drops off that random soldier dude over there. Like, okay, he's not special, therefore the armor he drops also isn't special, and you ultimately only care about spending resources to get the stats. Another thing that's very weird and feels like an old MMO system is this Khazan's memory section, where as you complete missions, you get these points to upgrade stats at the bottom. Sort of like world tiers or world progression or I don't know, something like that. You get these by either completing main missions or also completing side missions. As you can see, I just got 7 points there, got another few points there, I've got another few here. Oh, did I not select the right mission? I did not. There we go, 29. Now, because I have 29, I can upgrade stats. I can either spend it on a damage increase multiplier to get 1% more damage, or damage increase to get 1% more damage, or a stamina damage increase to get 1% more stamina damage. These stats really aren't very interesting. They aren't super impactful, but hey, this is equal to like 1 affix on gear, and you get a lot of a progression automatically for just playing the game. So as you have a point, do make sure to go to this screen and interact with it. It feels like a vestigial MMO system that doesn't really add anything to the game, but at least it doesn't get in the way of your gameplay too much. Another of those MMO systems is found in the Codex. You have these fun little challenges, like to get the Cutthroat Scroll, I need to defeat a Pellos Executioner, specifically by defeating them without taking any damage. On one hand, these are fun little extras, and most of them give stuff that doesn't really matter, like some special cleanse potions that you could easily craft yourself. Unfortunately, some of them, like the Earth Resistance Parchment, unlock your consumables, making them pretty important, and honestly, I wasn't a big fan of having to do weird random challenges to get stuff that I wanted in terms of crafting. Again, feels like something that made more sense in an MMO rather than a single-player RPG. So what's the verdict? Well, if you enjoy stringing together long combos and completely overpowering your foes with awesome gory attacks, the First Berserker Khazan is definitely going to be up your alley. Initially, normal enemies are pretty challenging, and combat starts out slow and intentional. Your stamina bar almost feels oppressive. But very soon, as you start incorporating some skills into your rotation, and as you learn how to break enemy stances, all of a sudden you can just steamroll normal enemies. And not only that, you get to do really cool stuff, like killing a flying enemy by exhausting it over a cliff. After all, you can't fly when you're exhausted. The end result is fast, fluid, and it reminds me a lot more of a spectacle fighter like Bayonetta than it does a game like Dark Souls or Elden Ring. But make no mistake, while you can easily overwhelm enemies, you can also get yourself in a tight spot, especially if you're against multiple foes, and they can also overwhelm you. So be sure to have some of your skills handy, as these will give you the edge which you need when taking on more than one combatant. And on the other hand, if you like getting crushed by powerful foes, well, each of the game's bosses is happy to provide that service, and you know what? They'll do it for free. You don't even need to pay them. Well, for free after you've bought the game anyway. Many of these fights were brutal, and a couple of them took me several hours of attempts. But because you get Lacrima for fighting bosses, you're heavily incentivized to go from boss to boss, taking on ever stronger foes, even if you aren't quite prepared for it. And personally, I really enjoyed this approach, because these singular foes present a challenge, but you can focus on learning the boss and its ins and outs, and oh boy, does it feel great to start blocking everything, countering it for right time, and finally taking the fight down. Now, I've heard some people say this is the hardest Souls-like they've played. Personally, I found it to be easier than Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree, so either I've gotten better at Souls-likes because I keep playing them, or maybe Consort Radahn was just one hell of a fight. I definitely put it on the more difficult side, but I wouldn't quite give it the #1 spot. But what about the rest? Well, the level design's fine, but I always felt like I wanted to get through it as quickly as possible to get to the next boss fight, in part because the boss fights were so exciting, and in part because the levels themselves were kind of boring. When it comes to builds, I found the individual items to be lackluster, in part because enemies constantly threw loot at me, and none of it felt that meaningful. On the other hand, it was really cool to specialize my build by combining set effects with active skills, and especially to use some of the skills that were granted by set effects. Personally, I would have preferred if the items were a little bit more iconic. Maybe each boss drops their own set, and those are the stats, it's fixed, you just use it for the rest of the game. But trust me, the skills go a long way to make up for that, and I only played one weapon, the spear. I could easily see myself in the future doing an entire different playthrough on either dual wield or greatsword. Also, speaking of minor disappointments, I was really hoping the Phantom system would do more. You select bonuses from one of the Blade Phantom's apparitions, and it's just a set of passives. You don't get new skills, you can't even summon them to aid you in battle. I think this is a big miss, as the Blade Phantom himself and his relationship with Khazan is barely explored throughout the story. There's a couple missions, and I think some of them are actually the more interesting ones, but there really isn't that much. Speaking of, what's the story?
We're here to kill chaos.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. About a third of the way through, I started skipping the cutscenes, because I just didn't care anymore and I wanted to get back to fighting the bosses. Last up is a couple of weird leftover MMO systems, like getting this bonus for completing missions. Didn't really degrade my experience, and the bonuses are small enough that I never felt like I had to grind. I just got some passive bonuses. But like with the Phantoms, I don't think this system added anything to the game either. So overall, I would say that this is a very solid Souls-like. In fact, it's up there with Lies of P as one of the best Souls-likes I've played that wasn't made by From Software. But the combat and the bosses are absolutely where the game shines. I was always looking forward to the next fight, and I was always glad at how distinct each boss felt. Yeah, some of the side elements, the loot, level design, and story do feel lackluster, but none of these things took away from the core experience, because at the end of the day, it's just fun to be fighting something in First Berserker Khazan. And so that said, I'm curious, does this game look up your alley? And also, what are some of your favorite Souls-likes not made by From Software? I think for me, this is the sort of game that while I enjoyed it, it's not going to be too memorable. I'm not going to think about it a month from now or a year from now. And this is because, again, the lore really didn't grab me. I don't care about the world, I just liked fighting stuff. So because I like fighting stuff, I'm very likely to come back anytime there's a DLC or a sequel. And because of that, yes, I did mess around with New Game Plus. Overall, I'd say the gear gets a little bit more interesting. It's fun to fight stuff again, but it's probably not worth it unless you're really into the game. So if you want to see my thoughts on future content or other games, do be sure to get subscribed and leave a like while you're down there. It's going to be it for me today, so thank you very much for watching to the end. I'm glad you've enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.